just like color.
I'm not saying it looks bad, I was just wondering.
Yeah.
So here we are in 3-1. Extrema. 3-1 deals with Extrema. You probably call them extremes, but your book likes to go all Latin on you and pluralize the word by just putting an A at the end of it. Call it Extrema. Making the singular extremum. Find all the extremum.
Wouldn't that just be find the extremum?
Yeah, you're right, I said that wrong. Find the extremum. Singular. So if you drive a Toyota Maxima, that's actually bad grammar, right? Toyota makes the Maxima, right? Yeah. You actually drive a Maximum. And if you two people own it, then you drive Maxima. But you don't drive a Maxima, you drive Maxima.
That sounds really silly.
So we're talking about extremes on an interval.
Now I'm confused in English classes. Hell, it's coming. Job well done, Mr.
Extremes are just highs and lows on a graph. Peaks and valleys, call them what you will. There's really 4 types. You can have an absolute. Sometimes they'll call this a global, means the same thing. Max. Maximum. Generally, they'll call it an absolute max. Sometimes, I suppose, if a problem writer wants to be old school or trickier, they'll call it a global max. It means the greatest y value anywhere on the entire domain of a graph. Like king of the world. This is the Mount Everest of extremes. It's the highest point anywhere you look at anywhere. Nothing's higher than Mount Everest. Nothing's higher than an absolute max. All right. And there's a relative, or a local max. A relative max might be the highest point in like a state, or the highest point in a country. Yeah, well, McKinley, if you want to go all that far. So this is the greatest y value in a, let's say, neighborhood of a graph's domain.
So there needs 2 set spots
If there's a, if there's a tie, they'd both be absolute maxes. But and we'll look at some examples of this. But if you've got like a little bump and then a big bump, the little bump would be a relative max, and the big bump would be the absolute max. I guess technically the big bump would also be a relative max because it's the highest point in the area too. But
If it was like a little ball, but ways away.
We'll draw some pictures in a little bit.
Whoa, now, that escalated quickly.
Very quick, sorry.
There's also an absolute minimum. I think once you understand the concept of an absolute maximum, an absolute minimum isn't going to really shock you with any new information. It's just the lowest point over the graph's entire interval. This is the Mariana stretch.
So opposite of.
Opposite of type 1.
And what would you suspect to be the fourth type of extreme? Relative min. Yep.
Yeah, that's what I was thinking.
That's what I was going to guess.
That's where we go.
Whoa.
Grab some pictures in order.
Yes.
So we have a high point here that's supposed to be noticeably higher than this point. Maybe I didn't make that very clear. Okay. That's probably better. It isn't necessarily true that every graph has to have an absolute max or an absolute min or relative max or relative min, but this one has at least some of those components. The absolute max, I'm just going to start tracing this graph. Let's do this even. I'm just going to start tracing this graph. You tell me when we get to some sort of extrema, whether it's relative or absolute. All right? Just tell me stop. All right. That thing is a what?
Absolute.
It's an absolute max. There is no point higher than that point. That is your absolute max.
Alright.
Maximize your abs.
Yeah, they did.
All right. Continuing on our extreme journey. Relative min? That's not the absolute min?
Absolute.
No, because it goes down.
All those darn arrows. Ah! But it is a relative min. A relative min. If you have a short uncle, he might be your min relative, but this is a relative min. Moving along. Alright, what do we got?
Relative max.
Relative max.
It would depend on the prices for it.
If you have an uncle named Max, he's your relative max.
Or your cousin named Max. He'd be relative.
The second or could be the third or fourth. If this proceeded to kind of, these would all be relative maxes. Because they're the greatest Y value in the neighborhood.
True.
This does not have an absolute min. There is no absolute min because both sides of this, well, if even one side of it went down to negative infinity, there'd be no absolute min. Handleable so far?
Definitely.
Alright, another picture.
But we can't do a movie reference on YouTube, so. What?
Yeah, let's do that. This endpoint is included, this endpoint is not. This is like batteries on Christmas morning. Not included.
disorderly conduct. Don't ask.
Alright.
Yeah, okay, this is sort of weird. As far as relative extrema go, I guess you could make an argument that this is a relative max. It's sort of tough to tell. It is higher than the points around it. I don't know. It's never really that big of an issue whether or not you want to count endpoints in relative extrema. I would say this. If you got an endpoint and it's an absolute max or an absolute min, go ahead and include it. If you got an endpoint that's maybe a relative min or a relative max, I would say include it or don't. I'm not going to really get too picky either way. So endpoints and absolutes are, eventually we're going to be working more with absolutes anyway. But for today, look for absolutes at endpoints. Don't get too worked up about relatives at endpoints. That makes sense?
Alright.
Because you don't really know if there's more to the story over here. Who knows? Alright, but is there an absolute max on this thing?
I would guess so.
Yes.
Top right corner.
Let's say that this height of this circle was at like 4.
Would it be an absolute max as something approaches 4?
Yeah, I mean it'd be a 3.9. But then again, 3.9 repeating is actually 4 anyway. So that's sort of a contradiction. You know that? 3.9 repeating is actually 4. Craziness. Yeah, so it's going to suffice for us to say though, there is no absolute max. Simply because the endpoint where you would see the absolute max is not even included in the graph. So you can't put a specific quantity on what the actual height is. If this were filled in, we could say, yeah, it's 4. If it's not filled in, we say, we can't quantify it, so we're just going to say absolute max. Relative max, again, this endpoint, you could say this endpoint would be, but I'm not going to get too worked up about endpoints and relative maxes. How about absolute min?
Yep.
Does that exist?
Yep.
Sure, it's right at the bottom here, isn't it?
Right there.
There's your absolute min. Is there another like relative min beyond that?
I would say no.
No.
Good job.
Make it 4K.
Alright. So far so good? Super duper.
I don't think the ground's frozen.
And it'll be all